Chairwoman's mic, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Witness mic, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Witness mic, 1, 2.
Subcommittee on Homeland Security will come to order. Admiral Schultz, I welcome you back to appear before the subcommittee, and we are pleased to have you here to testify today. I'd like to start by extending my gratitude to you and all the men and women of the Coast Guard for your service to our nation. Through my travels over the past years, I have learned so much about the Coast Guard's varied critical missions. In the FY2020 bill, I was pleased that we were able to provide the Coast Guard with over $10 billion in discretionary funding. This appropriation funded important investments to recapitalize the Coast Guard's air and marine assets, including 4 additional fast response cutters, an additional HC-130J aircraft, additional MH-60T helicopters, and long lead time materials for a second polar security cutter. I was also pleased that in our enacted bill, we were able to provide expanded childcare support for Coasties families, as well as new resources for workforce readiness and diversity recruiting. Looking at the FY2021 request, I'm pleased to see continued and expanded investment in workforce readiness, new investments in cybersecurity, and the Coast Guard's aging information technology infrastructure, as well as funding to complete the procurement of a second polar security cutter. Unfortunately, some areas of the FY2021 Coast Guard request are less promising. It leaves large holes in infrastructure programs and procurement for assets such as the Fast Response Cutter and the C-130. I also want to take a moment to express frustration about the lack of complete information we have received regarding funding increases to the Offshore Patrol Cutter program. I acknowledge it is the department, not the Coast Guard, refusing to give us this information. However, I hope you will relay to the department the importance of giving us the requested information so the subcommittee will feel comfortable continuing the current procurement path for this important asset. We look forward to hearing from you today about your fiscal 2021 request and whether it would provide the resources that you need to support your important and varied missions. Thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to our discussion. I would now like to turn to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Ranking Member Fleischman, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Admiral, before I begin with my statement, just a note of thanks to you, sir, and your staff here. I knew before I took this position that the United States Coast Guard was something very special. I've had other commandants before us and the like, but because of your attentiveness and attention and the mission that your folks have done, I just want to say we are fortunate as Americans to have an exemplary fighting force like the United States Coast Guard and all the diverse missions that you do. And you face some unique circumstances being under this prestigious subcommittee and not under DOD. But the men and women did such a great job throughout the government shutdown. You stood up for the Coasties day after day, and your staff did as well. But thank you for an exemplary job done for our country, sir. Admiral, I want to welcome you. Of course, we're going to sit down and talk about the Coast Guard's fiscal 2021 budget request. I want to offer my thanks for you coming here today, of course, to show us the many operations that the Coast Guard does and for taking us to Alaska. The chair and I were up there. That was truly a fantastic trip. One can't really understand the physical magnitude of the Coast Guard's mission until you see it for yourself. Again, I thank the chairwoman, Ms. Roy Ballard, and you, sir, and the people for an education on what the Coast Guard does day in and day out at the farthest regions of this country. Admiral, like last year, the budget before us appears to be carefully balanced, many different funding needs across the Coast Guard to ensure the agency can respond to everything that comes its way. A lot of investment and reinvestment needs to occur every year and to keep you mission ready. Most notably, this budget continues to build upon the current year's initiatives to improve the recruitment, retention, and investment in the Coast Guard's #1 asset, its people. Without a doubt, I see our first responsibility is to ensure the people of the Coast Guard have what they need to succeed. Unfortunately, it appears that hard choices had to be made in crafting the request for procurement, construction, and improvement funding, and I'm sure there are a few other places across the budget where more could be done to address readiness needs with a few more dollars. I appreciate the challenge OMB probably handed you when the budget was being developed. Last year, you noted in your testimony that the Coast Guard's $340 million in defense readiness dollars hadn't increased in 18 years. I'd say that in those 18 years, the Coast Guard has not only added to its list of responsibilities and admirably risen to meet the challenges of a more complex maritime environment. Madam Chair, I think that the defense discretionary disparity merits some attention, and I offer my support to help the Coast Guard see a bigger piece of that funding so that we can continue to address maintenance backlogs, improve physical infrastructure to meet the delivery of new assets, and finally, to recapitalize and reinvest in the surface and aviation assets and technologies that the men and women of the Coast Guard rely on to do their jobs. I know our subcommittee allocation is never as high as we would hope it will be to cover all the funding priorities we identify across the Department of Homeland Security, but I'm hopeful that as the bill comes together, we on the committee can work together with you, sir, to address these needs. Thank you again for your testimony today and your service to our great nation, sir. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Before we hear from the Admiral, first a few housekeeping items. The order in which members will be called for questioning will be based on the seniority of those present when the hearing was called to order, alternating between majority and minority members. To ensure everyone has ample opportunity to ask questions, I would ask each member to keep their turn to the allotted 5 minutes per round. And now, Admiral Schultz, thank you again for joining us. Please provide a brief summary of your testimony, and we will submit the full text of your official statement for the record.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Roybal-Allard, Ranking Member Fleischman, and members of this subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today and ask that my written statement be entered in the record as you noted, ma'am. Please accept my profound thanks, first off, for your unwavering support of the United States Coast Guard. The fiscal year 2020 appropriation funded our top recapitalization projects and represents a meaningful down payment on my highest priority, building and sustaining Coast Guard readiness. Today, your Coast Guard serves with impact across the globe to advance American security and prosperity, but the maritime domain is not static, and our service must continually adapt to an increasingly complex and technologically sophisticated maritime environment. Great power competition, well-financed and highly adaptive transnational criminal organizations, rapid technological advancements and cyber threats, and complex natural disasters all strain maritime governance. As I reflect on the past year, I couldn't be prouder of our Coast Guard men and women who answer the call to serve. You saw us first on scene following Hurricane Dorian, the largest and most devastating storm to hit the Bahamas. Millions watched in awe as Coast Guardsmen fearlessly leapt onto a narco sub traversing the eastern Pacific Ocean. National security cutters Berthoff and Stratton plied the East China Sea and the South China Sea, including Taiwan Straits, to promote free and open access and adherence to the rule-based order. Coast Guard service members rescued 24 trapped crew members from the overturned motor vessel Golden Ray, including 4 confined for more than 30 hours in temperatures exceeding 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The demand for our services has never been higher, and these selfless feats typify what dedicated Coast Guardsmen do each and every day. Yet these increasing demands amidst constrained resource levels inhibit our ability to build the Coast Guard the nation needs. While I'm encouraged by our collective focus to address these historic funding gaps, it's simply not enough. The path forward requires stable and predictable capital funding that aligns with acquisition schedules and roughly 5% annual operations support funding increases to preserve operational agility and restore and henceforth sustain readiness. The essential steps address readiness across 3 key areas: people, assets and infrastructure, and technology. First, people. People are the cornerstone of our success, and I remain committed to creating the conditions that not only attract the best our nation's diverse talent pool offers, but also provide an inclusive and rewarding environment that best positions the Coast Guard to be an employer of choice in this highly competitive marketplace for talent. Building on fiscal 20 21 request includes funding to expand diversity and inclusion initiatives, modernize our antiquated training system, and continue our transition to electronic health records. Regarding assets and infrastructure, similarly, continued efforts to recapitalize the Coast Guard's aging fleet of vessels, aircraft, and shore infrastructure is absolutely essential. Our sole operational icebreaker, the 44-year-old Polar Star, deployed to Antarctica again this winter for the annual McMurdo Station breakout. I recently had the opportunity to visit the crew and cutter down on the ice, the southernmost continent. I'm incredibly proud of their efforts, but I remain concerned that we are only one major casualty away from being a nation without any heavy icebreaking capability or capacity. The good news is that both the administration and the Congress have duly recognized the burden our Polar Star sailors bear to meet the nation's call. That's why I'm grateful for your support to fully fund our new Polar Security Cutter, the first modern heavy icebreaker to be built in the United States in a half-century, and I'm equally encouraged by the $555 million in this fiscal 21 request to fully fund construction of a second Polar Security Cutter. With your support, we're also making significant progress on our offshore patrol cutter, and I'm pleased to announce the keel laying for the first ship in the class, the Argus, will be held next month in Florida. These cutters remain my highest priority from an acquisition standpoint, and continued progress is vital to replacing our legacy fleet of medium-endurance cutters, many of which have been in service for 50-plus years. In addition, the fiscal 21 request includes funding to help address a portion of our $2 billion shore infrastructure backlog, advance our most important aviation initiatives, and continues the deployment of small unmanned aerial systems on our remarkably capable and game-changing national security cutters. On the technology front, to build and sustain the Coast Guard the nation needs, technological competence is critical. Yet years of constrained budgets have brought our IT systems to the brink of failure. The 21 request includes long overdue initial investments to begin replacing our failing IT infrastructure and to improve underway connectivity essential to our major cutter fleet. Downgraded IT readiness puts lives at risk, and we are embarking upon a whole-of-service effort to ensure our people are supported by a reliable, mobile, and integrated information system. I'm grateful for these meaningful first steps, but they cannot be the last. In conclusion, I'm honored to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to advocate for the men and women of our United States Coast Guard. Your continued support is essential to building the Coast Guard our nation needs and to enabling our tremendously capable workforce to live up to our motto of Semper Paratus, always ready. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral, for your testimony. I appreciate your focus and your vision for the future of the Coast Guard. And because it goes beyond cutters and aircraft to a genuine interest in the challenges and opportunities associated with your workforce, as well as the Coast Guard's aging facilities. I'd like to focus first on the dedicated men and women of the Coast Guard and our shared interest in providing innovative ways to support a more inclusive workforce and a more flexible, modern working environment. I understand you have implemented a few new policies after last year's delivery of the Women's Retention Study, and in your State of the Coast Guard address, you outlined several more talent management efforts. I think even relatively small investments in these areas, unlike almost everything else we deal with, can yield large returns. That is why last year we were pleased to add funding to the Coast Guard's budget for recruitment and retention initiatives. Could you discuss some of the initiatives being undertaken this year with that funding, as well as those proposed in the FY21 budget under your mission-ready total workforce training and support request?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Madam Chairwoman. So on the 20 budget, some of the things we did was we looked at, for our junior folks, lieutenants on the officer side, E6 and below, we aligned tour lengths. So if we had a dual service couple, one did not get 4-year orders, the other two, and then they struggled to figure out life choices, childcare, home buying. We did some things with our new mothers. You know, you get leave up to 84 days, but at small outlying units dispersed across the country, if you're one of a 35-member team, you know, people are port and starboard. They stand 2 days on, 3 days off. When you step out for 84 days as a primary caregiver, that puts a burden on the rest of the team. That was a tough choice for our new mothers or second or third-time mothers. We have a new program where we send the reservists in. So we want our mothers to step out, take the full leave, make the adjustments in their life, come back fully ready. We've had tremendous success. I think more than 120 reservists have stepped forth to enable us to do that. Most of these things, as you said, ma'am, stemmed out of our holistic women's retention study. We've kicked off back on May of 2019, just towards the end of the month, a 2-year underrepresented minority study, which looks from recruiting through retention across the careers of our underrepresented minorities to sort of draw the same type of learning. You know, what are we seeing in terms of retention? What are we seeing in terms of causative factors where we're not competing as well? So there's an ongoing a bevy of programs, ma'am, that we're continuing to focus on. We made some, minor changes to hairstyles, to fingernail polishes. We made some significant changes to what we used to be our weight standard. That's called the body composition standard. We ran through we do this weigh-in program twice a year, October and April. We went through the fall weigh-ins here in October with tremendous success. The new body composition standards, we were folks that didn't just get on the scale and check the block twice a year, that actually had to do what we call the taping process. We've added an abdominal circumference. We've added a pathway through fitness. We were discharging female colleagues who weren't able to get through as successfully on the first pass at a rate of 3 to 1. We've had tremendous success in the fall. I think here in April, after we go through this next round here, we're going to codify this as permanent policy changes. So that's just a spattering of the things we're working on, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We've got almost a $2 billion backlog of infrastructure, and that's hard. A healthy organization probably recapitalizes, a couple % a year, so we're nowhere close to that. What I would say, ma'am, with this committee and the Congress's support in 20, we're taking a small bite into that, and the 21 budget actually takes us further down the path. I think if we can continue to press in there, that'll be healthy. But we have places where, we're patching roofs versus fixing facilities that are really broken. Most of our infrastructure upgrades in recent years have come through supplemental funding that have followed, disasters through hurricanes in North Carolina, in Texas, in Florida. There is, decent amounts of funding here under major acquisitions, shore infrastructure, as we site new cutters. There's some programs here to get after some of the things. It's boat launch facilities. But I'll give you an example. We had a facility up in the Great Lakes in St. Ignace where, the guys and gals that are assigned, the men and women assigned to that unit are working on the boat in the winter months in the state salt facility where they have road salt. Up in Station Niagara last year with the heavy rains and floods, they dealt with 200,000 gallons of water a day for months on end a little bit. We anticipate high waters this year are going to have some of those same kind of challenges. So it's prevalent across the Coast Guard, but I'm guardedly optimistic, Chairwoman, that with the committee's continued interest, we're starting to bite into this $2 billion backlog. It's going to take a long time, but we're seeing positive signs of progress here.
Well, it really concerns me that despite the nearly $2 billion backlog of crumbling shore infrastructure, which you just described, 40% of which is over, my understanding is 50 years or older, that the President's budget request proposes deep cuts to last year's enacted level for all the lines that fund infrastructure. And so I'm hoping that the committee, we can work together to maybe help out a little bit in that area, or more than a little bit, I'm hoping.
And one thing I didn't answer, ma'am, from your question was, how does it impact us? It's a competitive disadvantage. So when folks look around and they think about their mobility, and that's the technology we're talking about elsewhere in the budget. And here it's when you come to work, it's that place, are you in a decent workplace? Is it just the leaky roof that gets fixed, or is it a place that's got mold, that's got other problems, that doesn't have working HVAC and other things? I think that's a competitive disadvantage for us in a very competitive marketplace for talent. So I think there's an equal imperative that we need to get after that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Admiral Schultz, as we ponder the 2021 request, the Coast Guard seems to be lagging far behind the 21st century technology wave with antiquated equipment and an IT infrastructure that can barely keep up with the rapidly changing threat landscape, both as it applies to the Coast Guard's oversight of maritime operations and with cybersecurity in general. Your budget request includes modernizing the Coast Guard's cyber infrastructure through a Tech Revolution initiative. Admiral, can you please take a moment to describe the effects of your current reduced capability and the steps this initiative that will bring the Coast Guard to a more sound technology footing and be prepared to engage in this new environment? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Ranking Member Fleischman, thank you for the question. Let me kind of dive into the tech first. So the backbone of our what we call our enterprise mission platform, that's what we ride on day-to-day work that our Coast Guard men and women work on, the technology backbone. You know, we're 3-4 years beyond obsolescence on that. So we're fixing systems that break. We had a system crash last year. We lost 90-something systems that ride on that backbone, and it was days on end, and it affects operations. It went right down to basic functionalities like Coast Guard's been able to do email in the workplace. We've got to refresh that on an industry standard type rate of refresh, and we're working towards that. We've got to put more mobility in our hands. The budget includes $2 million to continue delivering mobility. We're hoping to have a new application for our marine inspectors and our aviators on an iPad-type laptop that they can take to the field. A young man or woman goes out today, they spend 10, 12 hours of boarding on commercial vessels, and they put in a good, long, hard day. They go back, and they got a fat finger about 9 hours of administrative data that they should be able to do in the field. In some cases, they have more capability on their personal mobility than they have on their desktop at their office place. Enterprise mission platform, satellite communication, MILSATCOM, there's monies in that. Cutter connectivity, I just came back from the Major Cutter Commanding Officer Conference. They hold that once a year up at the Coast Guard Academy. So those men and women that serve on those 50-plus-year-old 210s, 35-year-old 270s, even national security cutters, they can't do the business of the Coast Guard, procurement, things like port clearance requests, all the different federal acquisition rates to comply. Some of that is limited by just bandwidth at sea. We're investing $7 million here on that. Shifting gears, sir, for cyber, the 21 budget includes about 190 positions for cyber. That'll allow us 93 plus or minus are on defensive cyber. We reside on the .mil domain. That's the DoD backbone for all our day-to-day computer. So we have to be compliant there. There's significant cost that goes with that, particularly when you're riding on old architecture like we are. There's 70-plus billets that get after development of some cyber offensive capabilities, some enabling operations to get after transnational criminals. So there's money, sir. I think we're seeing this, this tech revolution, this tech refresh. We're laying some breadcrumbs. Probably need about a $300 million investment over the coming years to really get after that. But the 21 budget, sir, gets us out the door in tackling some of those priorities.
Thank you, sir. Admiral Schultz, in fiscal year 2020, the committee provided $260 million for 4 fast response cutters for the Coast Guard, funding a total of 54 domestic ships to date. Only 4 hulls remain to reach the FRC's program of record of 58 domestic cutters. The fiscal 2021 budget does not include funds to continue this program. It is my understanding the contract stipulates that orders are to be made in increments of 4 or 6 cutters. My questions are, and there's 3, is there a reason the Coast Guard is proposing a reduction to this program? Second, what level of funding would be required in 21 to finish the 4 remaining FRCs? Looking at the current program of record, has the Coast Guard already selected where the last 4 cutters in the plan would be home ported, sir?
So, Ranking Member Fleischman, thanks for the question. Domestic program of record is in fact 58 fast response cutters. With the support of the Congress and some flexibility in the language, we have 6 additional cutters that we intend to forward deploy to Bahrain, to our patrol forces Southwest Asia. At this point, we are short 4. The 21 budget includes $20 million for the fast response program, but there are not additional hulls requested in the 21 budget. That is a functionality of just head space or top space in the budget as we lift Polar Security Cutter and offshore patrol cutters as our top priorities, some other aviation upgrades. As I understand the contract, sir, because we're past the 58, it's 54 domestic, it's actually 60 hulls, hopefully driving to 64. There may be some flexibility to go after just 2 ships a year or 4 ships in a single year. I think if you put a number on that, sir, and I'd like to circle back with a more, higher fidelity number, I think you're about $50 million per fast response cutters. You're probably a couple $100 million for the procurement of 4 additional vessels, Congressman.
Thank you, sir. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Rufusberger.
Yeah, well, thank you. First thing I want to acknowledge, too, I think the Coast Guard does a tremendous job. I think you're a tremendous leader and have a great team. I know that the chairwoman, ranking member, and I went on the Codell to Alaska, learned a lot. You have tremendous responsibility. We did go up to the Arctic, and we do know that China and Russia are really focused, and we have to stand up, and thank God we have Alaska as part of our country, too. I want to get into two areas, cyber security and national security cutters. The Coast Guard is a branch of U.S. Armed Forces, a law enforcement organization, regulatory agency, a first responder, and a member of the U.S. intelligence community. Most people don't realize the last role I mentioned. The President's budget request includes $17.4 million to establish a Coast Guard capability for cyber-enabling operations. The program will include 71 new positions, including staff to operate a cyber mission team and a cyber support team. Additionally, the President's budget includes $1.2 million for cyber training programs and providing for the first permanent cyber staff judge advocate to advise on laws and regulations. In my eyes, these are all great investments. Cyber is extremely important to our future and our future national security. And I want you to touch on how the increase in funding will be used in partnership with the Department of Defense and how it will bolster your capability to counter adversaries in the domain. I'm going to get this next question because I have another hearing I have to go to, too, which is within my time. Also, I want to ask you about national security cutters, which are essential to your fleet and are responsible for many critical Coast Guard missions, including drug interdiction in the Eastern Pacific. I understand in addition to their Coast Guard duties in 2019, there were 2 national security cutters on consecutive 6-month rotations in Indo-PACOM in support of the Navy's 7th Fleet. I also understand that one of these ships returned from her deployment last November, and as recently as August of 2019, Vice Admiral Fagan, the Coast Guard Pacific Area Commander, talked about the value of these ships and said the Coast Guard was still mulling their potential continued use in Indo-PACOM. I know the Indo-PACOM covers 100 million square miles, or over half the globe, and I think it's great that a national security cutter is able to support the 7th Fleet there. I hope they'll be able to continue that support, but worry that will cause them to be overextended on their other primary Coast Guard missions. What I'm really leaning to is there a plan to place in place for additional NC rotations in 2020 and beyond, because the contract is over this year and we need to have a way forward.
So, Congressman, I'll take the last question first. So in terms of the Indo-Pacific commitment in calendar year 2020, we deployed about 320-plus days back-to-back or heel-to-toe rotations of the Berthoff and Stratton, 2 of our national security cutters, our flagship cutters. Tremendously capable. We will be back supporting that theater again, supporting Admiral Davis and the Indo-PACOM team. We'll participate in Rim of the Pacific, the largest maritime exercise in the world, and we'll also be patrolling across Oceania and in the Indo-Pacific theater. Those national security cutters, I think, have shown their value in that theater. They showed their value in the Eastern Pacific and the counter-drug mission off the coast of the Bahamas this year, Dorian, controlling multiple aviation assets, cutter assets. So they're tremendously capable ships, sir. So you will see more NSC contributions to the Indo-PACOM theater. At the end of the day, it's a little bit back to the ranking member Fleischman's conversation about how much can I contribute to that theater in terms of how we're funded in the Coast Guard, but you will see NSC commitment there, sir. Shifting to the cyber, was that
that's cyber
responsive, sir, on the national
really important, and I'm glad to see there's resources going into that area for the Coast Guard.
Cyber is the largest growth area in the 21 budget, sir. 190 positions, about $33 million. There's 22 cyber professionals that will go out to our critical ports at our sector commands. We have 35 sector commands across the Coast Guard, so the New Yorks, the Houstons, the Jacksonvilles, places where they're critically significant economic or military ports. We're going to put a cybersecurity professional on the sector port team. That'll be an interface with the field, the industry, the other stakeholders, state, local, federal, military units. Walking it back on the defensive cyber, there's 93 billets for the compliance, as I mentioned to Mr. Fleischman's question, to allow us to reside in the DoD domain to stay cyber compliant. 71 billets to start looking at offensive cyber effects. Cyber is a complicated domain. We partner today with U.S. Cybercom. We've got Coast Guard men and women assigned at Fort Meade. They go to work there every day. We're working with DHS CISA on election security. A lot of our cyber development of our workforce comes from those interactions. There's a lot of schools that involve in cyber. I think one of the challenges that will face us in the cyber community, sir, is just the development and the retention of talent, absent some money to throw bonuses and things at folks. But 190 bodies for CMT, cyber mission teams, a second CPT, cyber protection team, a cyber support team, the judge advocate, a couple other trainers, and the 22 people at the sector. So that is going to be a really substantial bite into upping our game on the cyber domain.
Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Ranking Member. Commandant Schultz, welcome. It's always a pleasure to have you in our committee. Appreciate you being here. Thank you for your fine update. Also, we don't get this opportunity very often, so I just want to take a second to express my thanks to not only your leadership, but that also of the men and women under your command. I've said before that the Coast Guard has a critical mission, and I truly believe that in protecting our national security. And I think I can say that you won't say this, but under your leadership, the capability has increased tremendously of the Coast Guard. So thank you for that. I believe that we've all been able to visit some of the installations. I believe the commitment of the men and women that we've seen truly do add to that great amount of success that we see as well. So you pledged operational readiness, that was your top priority. I think we can safely say that we've seen that. And so, again, just take a second to express our appreciation for the work you do. I want to talk or ask you about one thing in particular. Last year, you testified to us about the success of the national security cutters that you were having, integrating the unmanned aerial systems into their operations. In fact, I think if I can quote you, you tell me if I get this right or not, that you said that the Scan Eagle was a game changer. And so your charge was to outfit your entire fleet, I think is a goal that you're about to realize. So commend you for that. Given those added capabilities that these offer you, how can you expand these unmanned systems beyond the NSC fleet? Do you plan to do that? What's your strategy with the Scan Eagle? And certainly a key question, how can we help you with that? And are there any additional capabilities that associated with this technology that we can certainly help support as well?
Congressman Newhouse, thank you for the question, sir. Yeah, we are very excited about the UAS, Unmanned Aerial System capabilities, and we're doing some things at the sectors with very small quadcopter type drones for environmental spills, mapping areas. When you talk about the national security cutters, the 21 budget has about $0.6 million or $600,000 that allow us to outfit the 9th NSC with that small UAS Scan Eagle capability. I've visited General Atomics. One of the things as we talk about the counter-narcotics mission or any mission that's enabled by persistent surveillance is persistent surveillance. They have an MQ-9 Maritime Guardian model that now flies almost 40 hours, has very capable EOIR, electro-optical infrared capabilities for day-night searching. That type of persistent presence, sir, could be game-changing. U.S. Southern Command is doing an operation right now with Customs and Border Protection, who mans the MQ-9 fleet in the Department of Homeland Security. We have some Coast Guard pilots, ground station controllers that are part of that mission. They're doing a forward deployment in Panama, flying untethered. Typically, we've flown those with a high bird, a P3, or an AWACS, other type of AWACS, or ground-based radar. We've actually untethered that thing the department has in recent weeks, and it's being tremendously successful. I think we're scratching at the next iteration of what we can do. We've done some land-based UAS tests. We did that in Puerto Rico in the spring of 2018. We did that in Corpus Christi, or in Texas, maybe it wasn't Corpus last year. So we're looking at some land-based unmanned aerial systems utilization, possibly with a Scan Eagle or Scan Eagle-like small UAS, and then getting into something bigger within the department's wheelhouse of MQ-9 Guardian expertise, or even possibly looking at this bird that has longer legs. What they're doing now in the Panama operation, I think gets you about 13 to 15 hours a day. Something that having even longer legs could surveil most of the Eastern Pacific Ocean. Right now, we're patrolling North America with 5 police cars. That's kind of the equivalent time, space, distance challenge down there. MPA, Maritime Patrol Capability, ISR capability is game-changing. So we're absolutely interested in that, sir. Sometimes it's a function of what we can fit in the budget, but we've been smartening and getting wiser on what's out there, and would welcome additional conversations on that.
Okay, I appreciate that. Look forward to working with you on expanding those capabilities. Yeah. 5 patrol cars for the North America. That's quite the...
When you catch a speeder, you got to bring them back to Columbus, sir, because you got to bring them all back to the same place. That's about how daunting the challenge is.
Wow. Wow. Well, again, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to have you here. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Welcome, Admiral. Glad to have you before the subcommittee again. I have enjoyed working with you over the years. Most recently, recall in particular our visit to the Elizabeth City base last summer, looking in on the remarkable rescue swimmer training facility, the Aviation Logistics Center with a remarkable program of rehabbing and repurposing aircraft and so on. A good program, including an airstrip, which the Coast Guard allows one of our state's outstanding historically black colleges, Elizabeth State University, an airstrip which it's a dual-use proposition where the Coast Guard shares the usage of that airstrip with Elizabeth City State to use for its flight training program. This, by the way, is the only four-year professional pilot training program in North Carolina, and it's one of only 3 HBCUs to have such a program along the entire eastern seaboard. So it's very important. And it's relevant directly to our country's severe pilot shortage. So we need this program to succeed and grow, particularly in this very underserved region of our state. Now, you're aware, I believe, that Elizabeth City is in desperate need of an additional working runway at the airport in the next 2 years so that student pilots can log the hours and earn the FAA license they need for their degrees. The flight program has grown by about 50% in the last 2 years. It can't continue to grow without a renovated runway because, unfortunately, the airport's primary runway is not operational for about 98 days a year because of crosswinds. So there is a great need to renovate that second runway, which is currently not in use. There's talk of renovating the second runway and that the state of North Carolina is interested in using state funds to do this for this restoration project. If we did it that way, it would take only 1 to 2 years. My understanding is this rehab would be compatible with your C-103J operations, allowing the airport to provide better service to the Coast Guard, to university flight students, and to general aviation. That sounds like a win-win-win proposition, which our conference report last year noted, encouraging the Coast Guard to work with state and local partners, including institutions of higher learning, to determine the full scope of mutually beneficial enhancements to the runway. So I'm asking you essentially today for an update on these discussions, how the Coast Guard plans to ensure that this critical runway is repaired for the use of all the interested parties.
Congressman Price, thank you for the question, and thanks for your support, sir. And under your leadership, the rescue swimmer pool is a world-class facility, and as is ALC and things we do down there. So specific to runway 119, we have a due back to the committee here on both sides of the Hill here in April regarding status. I'm absolutely committed to a mutually beneficial scenario, sir. Elizabeth City State University, we have our college student pre-commission initiative, a memorandum of agreement there. We have a very great relationship. We're bringing, using that university to help us bring more diverse candidates into our ranks and the commission officer programs. That's a terrific program. What we have to figure out is, and we understand their aviation program, we have not used that runway 119 for the last 25 years. Civil aviation, I think, stopped 5 years ago. What we got to figure out is just to make sure that the state's interests there and our interests don't preclude us to be able to use that when we need to do that. Right now, it's a mission degrader. We've got to site aircraft sometimes outside of East City for heightened weather situations to be able to do a response thing. So having a runway here that isn't subject to the crosswind problems that we have on the runway that's open now, sir, I think is clearly in our best interest. So you have my commitment to make sure that we're on track to come up here and brief you. The due date here is coming up in April. I think we're close to having that conversation. I am committed to that mutually beneficial solution. It's just at the end of the day, sir, we got to preserve, our federal interest to use that airport when we need to do that and find sort of, some type of an arrangement there that doesn't limit what they can do at East City State University in terms of their aviation program, but also doesn't block our ability to use that 724-365 to do the work of the nation. I think there's probably a win-win in there, sir, as you know.
I'm glad to hear you say that because it does appear there is a solution at hand that would involve less in the way of a financial demand on the Coast Guard, and would provide a runway at sufficient standards for your essential uses. So I appreciate your commitment to
Yes, sir.
continue
We have
working on
another
this.
deliverable here, an unfunded priority list that generally is associated with the budget. I would have liked to have had that up there ahead of the hearings. That's still in the clearance process with an April due date as well. And I believe you'll see that, our interest in this Elizabeth City runway also reflected in that, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member. Admiral Schultz, it's great to see you, and I really want to reiterate what my colleague, Representative Newhouse, said. Your leadership is outstanding over this organization, and I know the commitment that you have to not just worrying about the facilities and the tools, but also your people. And I think that's probably the most admirable. I know you're concerned for the Academy, having reinstituted the Visitors Board. I appreciate that. And so thank you, and we look forward to continuing to help you make the Coast Guard the best it can be. And we've all seen firsthand the influence that China's Belt Road Initiative is having around the globe. And in the way that they're utilizing their military and economic coercion, really to get into a lot of these areas, and the Coast Guard operates in a unique space, I think, and plays a vital role in countering China's influence around the globe. And so, from your work in the Indo-Pacific, supporting 7th Fleet, to your work in the Arctic, also. The role that you play, making sure that the U.S. remains the preferred partner, is critical, I believe, and especially your work in the Arctic, where even though China is not an Arctic nation, here they are developing and building a strong ice-breaking fleet. That's a clue, and my question is, in that harsh Arctic environment, that comes with a lot of different unique challenges. Other than the ships, the icebreakers, what other capabilities do you need that are important that we help you with for combating that area of the globe?
Well, thank you, Congressman Rutherford, for your kind words about the men and women of the Coast Guard. Regarding, you're absolutely correct. The self-declared near-Arctic nation of China and Russia are both made the Arctic a priority, the high latitudes. So that should be important to us. It's a geographic, strategic area of importance, and it's a competitive space. Mm-hmm. And the other things that would be helpful to us as we're, I'm still finishing up detailed design on the first Polar Security Cutter this year. We'll start cutting steel early calendar year 2021. Hopefully ship delivery here in 24, early mid 24. Is communications. Right now, when the Cutter Healy are 2000 vintage, almost 20-year-old icebreaker, medium breaker, it's sort of a medium plus, but it can't really go to the Antarctic region. It doesn't have this kind of capability for heavy breaking. When they operate north of the Arctic Circle, most of the time they're without any connectivity. So we've got to figure out communications in the Arctic. That would absolutely be game-changing. Comment on any time I deploy a ship anywhere, my operations commanders deploy a ship, we need to be able to communicate with that ship, particularly given the stakes and the other competitors that we see in the region. That's one place, sir. Domain awareness. It is a vast area, and just the ability to see and understand that. On the good news front, we're partnering with U.S. Northern Command, General Shaughnessy out at NORTHCOM. We're starting to bring in some industry folks to have some conversations about what low Earth satellite, where there might be some capacity to figure out how to put a payload on there that could get after this communications problem. So while we're building out our capacity with ships, we're absolutely trying to put some of those enabling functionalities in place, sir, so when we deploy more frequently to the high latitudes, we can be up there and be, 100% effective.
Very good. Well, I look forward to helping you with that. You mentioned also the South China Sea. Can you talk just a little bit more, because I think that's a critical role that a lot of people aren't aware that the Coast Guard is really there making sure that we have open seas and access. Can you talk a little bit about what we're doing there?
Yes, sir, Congressman. I would tell you in 2020 those 10 months, 5 months back-to-back across 2 national security cutters. I think we're critically important. The U.S. Navy had a loss of capacity with the Fitzgerald and the McCain, so we were able to free up some of the Navy's ballistic missile-capable ships for higher priority areas. We were doing sanctions work, DPRK sanctions work here at some point. We're doing capacity building. The Berthoff did a Taiwan Strait Freedom of Navigation transit. I think the other piece that we bring to the region is really the ability to build partner capacity. As I look across the 10 ASEAN nations, 5 or 6 that are really maritime powers, the Philippines have a 4,000-person Navy. They have an 11,000, almost 12,000-person Coast Guard building to 35,000. You know, we help them with a capacity standing build. There's other partners. The Japanese have given them patrol boats. They're giving them a couple large offshore patrol cutters. I think we can help build capacity. That United States Coast Guard cutter with the iconic racing stripe connotates maritime governance, rules-based order, free and open seas. I think when the China Coast Guard ship is running down, you know, a Philippine or a Vietnamese fisherman out near one of the disputed shoals, I think we can call out that behavior. That's not how the world's best Coast Guards behave. Well, that's how the United States Coast Guard behaves. That's one of the unique values I think we bring to the region, sir.
Right. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Ranking Member, thanks, Admiral. Good to see you again. Admiral, I don't want to duplicate Mr. Newhouse's question, but I did want to talk a little bit about small UASs. So you mentioned the MQ-9 and the Reaper that's had some success. Can you talk to me a little bit about the SUASs on the National Security Cutter fleet in the past year? What capabilities do you see, and how can we integrate these into future operations? What additional capabilities do you need, and is this something that can support an older class of vessels as well?
Thank you, Congressman. First and foremost, we are fielding them on every national security cutter, and I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule, and that's with the support of the committee, and very appreciative of that. You know, the sailors, the captains of those vessels that have a Scan Eagle on board, they do not want to sail without it. So that ship, you know, when you're thinking about that analogy of patrolling North America with 5 cars, you know, there's multiple pieces that go to an interdiction package. It's a national security cutter. That's the best we bring. You know, the newest ship with a intelligence control, you know, space on board. It can process, it can contribute to national level intelligence. It has a helicopter in the back with an endgame shooting capability, shoot out the engines, and now you add the Scan Eagle. And then you have a maritime patrol aircraft, or maybe down the road a bit, a long-range UAS to stay up there and even give you longer persistence. That package at the end of the year brings home about 30 metric tons of drugs a year. That's about the average contribution of National Security Cutter. So the UAS is a gap filler. Today, there's intelligence that comes out of JAD of South that says, we think there's intelligence on a drug smuggling operation, a narco sub here. That's hundreds of miles away, 400 miles away. The National Security Cutter cranks up its turbines and they start heading in that direction. An airplane comes out of typically Comalapa in El Salvador. They fly 5 hours out. They got an hour or 2 on station. Then they got to go back to recovery because of the time, space, distance. When the National Security Cutter is getting closer, they can launch that Scan Eagle out 75 plus or minus miles from the ship and get on top. The ship, that target of interest, makes one change from when that airplane saw it and goes 30 degrees left. We go to the spot where it was. There's no vessel there. So that Scan Eagle gets on top. It can surveil the crew. We can decide that the circumstances are such where maybe we want to wait to first light, maybe because of how the vessel's configured, we want to take it down at night because of the EOIR, the infrared capabilities. We get to see the situation. It gives us overhead coverage for the safety of our boarding team. It's game-changing capability, sir. So I think what we want is more of that as we build out offshore patrol cutters, you know, which is our top priority, hopefully a fleet of 25. I'd like every one of them to have that capability. In terms of putting it on, retrofitting it on our 210s that are 52 years old, in some cases our 35-year-old 270s. So I don't think we don't have the flight deck, the size of the flight deck to support helicopter operations and Scan Eagle, and the ability to kind of take that out of the way. So on the NSC, it's a good fit. On the offshore patrol cutter, it'll be a great fit. On the polar security cutter as well, sir.
Sure. And what about the smaller ones though, that aren't the Scan Eagles, that are
Yes,
much
sir.
smaller, that might be capable?
We have been using some small quadcopters on some of our patrol boats. We're using them on our land-based units, sir. We're absolutely sort of taking the handcuffs off our folks and tell us, hey, for a modest investment, go purchase some of this capability and tell us what you can do with that. So we're learning every day on what we can do with some of these small quadcopters and stuff. There's some limitations on, you know, when's you can launch them and those kind of things, sir. But we're absolutely want to be a learning organization with small UAS.
Sure, I appreciate it. The Next, the polar security cutters. You just mentioned earlier a 2024 date. Can you talk to me about some of the scheduling risks that originally those were 2023, 25, and 26, and the GAO did comment on that, on the nature of that not being realistic. So can you talk to me about the kind of delivery of those vessels and what we should be looking at?
Congressman, we haven't built a heavy icebreaker here in the nation in about a half century, so it's different type of steel work, but I think we've partnered with VT Halter, a Mississippi-based firm that I think understands the design. We're maturing the design. Right now, scheduled delivery is in 24. There's some incentives, 0 to 30 days, 30 to 60, 60 to 90. We could pull it into the second quarter of 24 potentially, or maybe possibly into 23. So it's aggressive, when you look at Navy shipbuilding, you look at Coast Guard shipbuilding, potentially from an idea, detailed design to award and production, many times you're pushing up against 8 years. We're trying to 8 to 10 years. We're trying to do this in 6 years, but I think we've got a really good shot of being, very successful here. Pulling it left of 24. If I was a betting man, I would say let's see on that. But getting that ship in 24, I'm pretty darn encouraged that we're going to get there. Obviously, we haven't started cutting steel. There's a lot of work to do, sir, but I met with the VT Halter folks recently here, and they're putting together a tremendously capable team with smart engineers, and they're ready to get off to the races.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Admiral. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Ms. Ming.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for today's hearing. Thank you to all our committee staff for all your work. Also want to thank Admiral Schultz for being here today. Your service and commitment to our nation is appreciated. I also want to thank your team. A few months ago, last year at this point, we took a tour of our waterways in and near around Flushing, Queens, and it was really educational and fun to tour the waterways, the infrastructure, and see how your men and women help protect New York City. So thank you so much. Wanted to ask some follow-up questions from last year's hearing. We had discussed the lack of diversity in the Coast Guard. I know you mentioned the women's retention study that was released in March last year, and I commend your Personnel Readiness Task Force for moving forward on policy changes that disproportionately affect women and underrepresented minorities. According to this study, women had expressed concerns that alcohol consumption during port calls or when assigned to a majority men unit have led to increased rates of sexual assault. Wanted to ask if the Coast Guard conducts or provides sexual assault prevention trainings. Are the trainings, if so, are they mandatory, and what do they entail?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question, and I'm glad that you had a chance to get out and see our men and women in New York. That's a busy place, and they do terrific work every day, and there's a lot of partnerships from local, state, and other federal partners, so thank you, ma'am. On the front of sexual assault, prevention, response, recovery, and we're absolutely committed. I updated the strategy here in the fall of my first year in office, 2018. We do trainings. The 21 budget has resources in there to grow 14 additional support personnel for sexual assault, for our SARCs, or sexual assault response coordinators, and some staff to support them. There is training; it's mandatory. We're constantly trying to learn. This is a very difficult problem set, and treating young adults, and they are adults, in the alcohol issues, how you regulate that. Clearly, one sexual assault is one too many, and we're dealing with more significant numbers, and we will continue to press in. We had taken the sexual assault program, the SAPR program, we'd sort of pushed it down in the organization a little bit before I came on board. We recently pulled that out. It was in the Workforce Readiness group. We actually pulled it out and put it as a direct report to the Vice Commandant again here. So it continues to command top service leadership attention. We will continue to put energy against that until we drive those numbers down to zero. We may never achieve that, but it will continue to warrant that type of level leadership support, ma'am.
I'm just curious, what type of training is it? Do you have details like how long it is, what types of programs?
I don't have the details on how long. We've done some things with bystander intervention training. That has seemed to be one of the most well-received and the most, frank, real conversations. It's on the mess decks, the crew gathering areas at the small units where folks get a little vulnerable and open themselves up and have frank conversations, facilitated conversations by a professional trainer. that comes in. I think typically it's one of our lawyers. We've upped for our Coast Guard investigative service that investigates these delicate matters. We've sent our CJIS agents off to specialized training to do these sexual assault prevention cases, the SAPR cases. So we're heightening our cognitive knowledge of how to do this well while we're trying to train our workforce to drive down the numbers. I think we've seen an uptick in cases, and I'm always very cautious to say this. The upside of that may be people are more forward about coming forward and reporting it. You know, I'd like to see that uptick be a clear downtick where we say, hey, people are willing to report it, and now we're driving it out of our ranks. That's really where we want to be, Congresswoman.
Thank you. And then on the question of diversity, of the 40,000 plus members of the Coast Guard, roughly 13.7% are Hispanic and 5.9% are African American. Do you have a timeline when the Coast Guard will commission and release that study on improving recruitment and retention of minorities? Particularly, I found that the Coast Guard lacks more specific data on Asian American and Pacific Islanders who are serving in the Coast Guard.
So, Congresswoman, the Underrepresented Minority Study that we commissioned May of 2019 is a 2-year study. We are hoping to get some initial results this summer, sort of June, July timeframe, and start actioning that. We took the Personal Readiness Task Force, which I commissioned here at taking over the position, for 2 years. We actually extended that for a 3rd year so we could take that team of 7 people as an actioning arm. That's what we used when we did the Holistic Women's Retention Study. That was very effective to drive change fairly rapidly. So we're going to keep that team on board, hopefully start actioning that this summer. In terms of the numbers, you know, we're an organization of about 14.9% women in an American workforce of 50% women. There is tremendous opportunities to broaden our organization there. When you look at African Americans, we're about the same 6% that we've been for 15, 20 years. We set our enlisted workforce goals to go out and recruit 25% women, 35% underrepresented minorities. We are struggling right now in this competitive workplace to put bodies in seats at Cape May, yet alone get to those targeted populations for underrepresented groups. And we just, for the first time in a few years, of actually incentivizing a $7,000 recruitment bonus for someone to show up at Cape May, our training center, between now and May. So it is challenging. Last year, you know, the results were 22% towards that 25% of women, so we missed that mark a bit, 43%, so 8% over the 35% target. So we've had some success. What we have to really focus on is, you know, we bring folks to the organization. We have to be a more inclusive organization where someone who looks different to me sees a pathway, whether they want to serve for 4 years to success or they want to go on and be the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard or the Commandant. They start to see folks up the ranks that look like them, and they feel like they're part of an organization that's committed to their personal and professional growth. That's what we're focused on, ma'am. Lastly, we rolled out a new initiative here in March, multi-year program called the Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan. So this is going to heighten our D&I acumen. It's going to heighten leadership's acumen. It's going to really be about broadening the diversity workforce. It's 125 change agents that we started training that we're going to deploy, and we're pretty excited about that.
That completes the first round, so we're going to go for a second round. Admiral, I'd like to highlight another area of concern in dealing with the inland tender fleet. I was pleased to see a continued request to support the recapitalization of the Coast Guard's waterways commerce cutters. This fleet plays an essential role in directing the nation's marine transportation system, which accounts for more than $5.4 trillion in U.S. economic activity each year. It is my understanding that these cutters are nearly 55 years old on average, and that their mission is often impeded by severe states of disrepair, and that they potentially pose a threat to the health and safety of our coasties. A subcommittee staff toured an inland buoy tender in Alabama that was clearly aged so badly the crew could often not perform its mission due to needed repairs. For example, the cutter has a boiler which had not worked for a dozen years, and parts are often unavailable because they are no longer made. The cutter's engines are obsolete, and the cutter contains enough lead paint parts that the crew must have their lead levels monitored. Could you discuss the current state of the planning for recapitalization of these assets, what the FY21 funding will be used for, and the timeline for beginning a production?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. So first off, you're absolutely correct. We have a fleet, in some cases, the oldest in the fleet, I think, is approaching 73 years old. And that is well beyond useful lifespan of a cutter. We have a fleet of 35 vessels. Some are composite hulls, 160-foot, single unit construction tenders. Some are, barges pushing 75-foot, or tugs pushing barges. There's a hodgepodge, 75-foot barges, 100-foot barges. The 21 budget includes $25 million to continue marching forward with this Waterways Commerce Cutter Acquisitions Program. And we are moving in, we're in the acquire phase right now, so we're looking at what are the options, what's available out there, building out the workforce to do this. I think the good news is we are absolutely pressing in and moving forward with the Waterways Commerce Cutters. For those men and women that are on these older fleets, first and foremost, it's a limiting factor because the only women that can really serve on board have to be the officer in charge or the commanding officer, the warrant officer in charge based on the configuration of berthing. So these new ships, this fleet of 35 plus or minus ships is going to be open to both genders. That'll be tremendous. It'll create some opportunities on ships that don't deploy halfway around the world for 100 days a shot and a little more lifestyles that might be compatible to other family considerations. And on the lead stuff, we are approaching that very carefully. We don't go into areas and open them up and expose people to lead. We understand there's lead issues, lead abatement issues. We're getting after some of the abatement, even as we march towards a recapitalization. We have not stopped trying to attenuate that, but we do that very judiciously to not put our men and women in harm's way. We do track them from lead monitoring just to make sure we know what's going on, there's no airborne stuff elsewhere in the ship, through the normal wear and tear. So, ma'am, I say the good news story is we're after, in terms of giving an actual, when we're looking to put an RFP on the street. I'd like to get back to you, ma'am, because I don't have command of that detail here today. But this additional money, I think, is taking us down that path in this acquire phase. I think we're going to be ready to build out an RFP and get that out here in the coming months here.
My impression of your operations in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific is that the Coast Guard is interdicting a relatively small fraction of the total smuggling operations. Now, this is in no way a criticism of the Coast Guard, but rather a recognition of the size of the problem, which I understand will only increase as the southern border is being walled off. In order to increase that percentage and to be able to meet increased need would require growing the Coast Guard, its air and sea fleets, and its personnel. What is the Coast Guard's estimate of the percentage of drugs and other contraband interdicted at sea now? And has the Coast Guard done any planning or assessment to determine what expansion of the service is needed that could translate into increasing the rate of interdiction now and in the future?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. In terms of, last year, we stopped 208 metric tons, pretty consistent the previous year. The year before that was a little higher, 220, which is the highest point. So when you sort of take that out of metric tons and put it in more American layman's terms, it's about 460,000 pounds. That's a subset of 280 metric tons that JADF South, that's the detection and monitoring arm of the United States government. It's headed up by Coast Guard flag officer, as you know, but it's a joint command. When you look at what percentage of the total cocaine flow, all the cocaine in the world is cultivated in the Indian Rich, Colombia, Bolivia, Peru. Most of the cocaine destined for America comes out of Colombia. And we're stopping probably between 9 and 12%. And there's an intelligence component to that. What I would say is the signs of a good news story is under the change in Colombian leadership post March to Peace here, we've actually seen coca cultivation sort of plateau here at about 200, I think it's up to 212,000 hectares this year. It was about 208,000, but that had been going really off the charts for a bunch of years here. Coca turned into pure cocaine is up about 8% this year, but I think we're at a tip, we may be at the zenith of that. That is important. The Colombian government has shown a willingness to bring back aerial eradication. That can be game-changing. The Colombians have been manually eradicating, I think 40, 50% more than in previous years at great loss, physical, death and dismemberment of their people, taking to that very difficult mission. So there's a partnership, Colombian contribution, partner nation contribution, ma'am, in this drug fight. Was the partners are responsible for more than 53% of the outcomes last year. That on top of what we did, there's a good news evolving story there. But it is a difficult challenge. It's a capacity conversation.
I'm sorry.
No.
Has there any planning or assessment been done?
In terms of, ma'am, we've done some looks over the year when folks said, how many Coast Guard ships would it take to really bite into this threat? We know where about 85% of the drug activity is from an intelligence standpoint. That's actually coming down a bit. We're seeing our adversaries getting a little smarter. Things that we would exploit yesteryear, we're seeing a little uptick in the Caribbean, and that run from Venezuela to the Caribbean, they can almost go dark up to Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic without communicating. In the Pacific, where we push them farther out to sea, they're more vulnerable. We've had estimates that say north of 23, 24 cutters down on patrol on any given day. Today, I commit 4.0 coverage, so any day of the year, there's 4 Coast Guard major cutters. That's a medium endurance cutter, high endurance cutter, national security cutter, down vector. We're actually sustaining about 6.7, so we're 175% above our commitment to the U.S. Southern Command JADF South because we're committed to the mission. So it would be probably a 4 or 5-fold of that to actually, take a substantive bite out of that, ma'am. We have not. I can't give you the number of people. You're talking quite a few additional ships. You're talking, thousands of additional people if we're going to do that. We could do some more of that detailed analysis for you.
Okay. Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Admiral, you have stressed that your top priority is to restore the readiness of your people, to include ramping up efforts to expand recruiting, retention, and diversity and inclusion initiatives throughout the Coast Guard. Additionally, this Congress has successfully appropriated increases to Coast Guard childcare subsidies for military families living in high-cost areas. Can you please describe the effects of these additional funds and how they have or have not made significant impacts to current readiness of this nation's Coast Guard?
Ranking Member Fleischman, thank you for that question. That is a very important question. And this committee, specifically the leadership of this committee, has been hugely helpful and impactful. Fiscal 19, fiscal 20, you included $2 million each year. That has been built into our base now in 21. We have 1,700 children from 1,300 families participating in child care today. We house about 550 of 700 children in the 9 Coast Guard facilities. So that's all we have across the nation is 9. We allow DOD members to be in. There's about 50 DOD members there. There's some Coast Guard civilians. What we're seeing as we project out, we've been advertising the subsidy program, and it's been growing. So people are excited. We had a few speed bumps with implementation. We mapped over to the Navy system from a former, I think it was USDA program before. Some speed bumps, but people are excited about the program. I think we will be about $2 million short as we project out where we think we'll be in 21. The $2 million is getting eaten up pretty quick. One of the things that's out there that I've got to do a little discussion with my DOD counterparts, OSD counterparts, is there's a policy change from OSD recently about accessibility to DOD facilities. I think the goal was to focus on uniformed members, and they changed the priority for civilians and contractors. We were caught up in that we went to pretty much the lowest rung on that. I'm not sure if that was an unintended consequence or not. So I intend to have some high-level discussions with my DOD peers to find out what was the real intention there. If, in fact, that plays forward, that could take about 1,000, and there's an initiative, or excuse me, a stipulation in there where with 45 days advance notice, someone can be a DOD civilian, it could be a Coast Guard member, it could be bumped out with 45 days warning by a DOD uniform member, military member. I think the focus is to help the uniformed military members who move around on rotational orders as the top priority. I'm hoping we can get ourselves talked back into that, and that wasn't intended. But if that is in fact the case, there's about 1,000 Coast Guard children that could be displaced, and that subsidy would probably be another $6 or $8 million it would take to offset that if you really wanted to say where this might go. I'm guardedly optimistic that may not be the circumstances.
Thank you, Admiral. I'm glad that you talked about that, because that was in line with my next question. When we were in Alaska, sir, one of our stops was at a Coast Guard child care center. I was very interested in the challenges of providing reliable child care, especially in remote areas, and the importance of these centers in retaining parents in their service. Unfortunately, DoD recently announced that they will be moving active duty Coast Guard members to the bottom of the priority list for access to child care centers on DoD facilities. You alluded to that in your testimony. I've got some questions. In light of this, do you have any proposed ways forward to support your members' child care needs in the event that they are removed from current child care services due to the new priority system announced by DoD? And then finally, did DoD consult DHS or the Coast Guard prior to making this announcement, sir?
So, Congressman, let me sort of start in reverse order. First and foremost, you know, I have the privilege, not by law, but by privilege, the chairman, SecDef allows me to sit as a service chief with the Joint Chiefs, and I have the opportunity to have these kind of frank conversations, which I will. You know, when we changed our policy back in 2017, Title 14, where the Coast Guard resides in the U.S. Code, by law, we are required to put our civilian employees above DoD folks. So there is, if you sort of did a quid pro quo, you look across there a little bit, DoD military folks are below some of our folks. So if they did that as a baseline, I would say this doesn't look so egregious, or you can sort of see it. I'm not sure they were informed by that. I think we have to have the frank conversation, say what was the real intent here. I will certainly advocate for our military folks to be, you know, be put in a higher priority where they are today. And in worst case, I would advocate to grandfather folks that are in there so that we're not displacing folks, you know, with 45-day warning. So I would like to reserve this broke late February. I was traveling last week. I have this on my, you know, near-term week sort of radar to go over and try to have the right conversations with my DoD colleagues and see where they are. And I'd be happy to report back, Congressman, and give you sort of the rest of the story here once I have a chance to really have the right conversation. In terms of the consultation, I don't believe there's much consultation, but we've been working very hard on, we went on to the Navy system for the child care subsidy, managing that, and we've been in the, you know, really in the weeds on that because we had a few speed bumps. They underestimated, we underestimated how much staffing it would take. We're sort of the canary in the coal mine on their first run at this. So we've been absolutely working with our counterparts. To tell you, you know, straight up, not did we, what we heard about this policy change coming, I don't have the site picture on that, but I'd be happy to circle back and let you know that.
Thank you, sir. We wish you the best with this initiative. Yes, sir. I yield back.
Mr. Rufus.
I want to focus back to that CODEL that we went on in Alaska. We learned a lot, and I want to talk about when we went up to the Arctic, the Russia-China issue, the threats that are there. What did you see the threats are? And what did we need to do to make sure that we stay competitive with Russia and China? I think Russia cares more about the geography, and China cares more about the minerals that are in that area. And you also might want to mention why it's so important that we have the ice breaker.
Congressman, I would tell you, sir, first off, thanks for the question and thanks for the opportunity to take yourself and the chairman, Mr. Fleischman, up there. You know, when you see things, I think is a different level of understanding. So the near term or the self-declared, you know, near Arctic nation of China is interested in a couple of things. You know, the defense across the Arctic. You know, we're citing F-35 fifth-generation aircraft up there in Alaska for national defense reasons. There's interest in paying attention to what they're doing. There's $1 trillion of minerals on the seafloor, fairly shallow seafloor, palladium, zinc, gold, other things they care about. 13% of the untapped petroleum products, a third of LNG. When you sort of look at China's energy situation, they're keenly across the globe looking at places and sources of energy. I think that's China's interest there. Also mapping undersea cables and other things up there. And there's also fish stocks. 50% of the fish we consume in this nation comes from the Bering Sea. As we see climatological changes in the Arctic, we're seeing migratory species moving further north. So there's a lot of reasons why China's looking there. China today, you know, a couple of years ago, they had one research vessel they got from the Ukrainian, the Snow Dragon #1. They built a second Snow Dragon 2, similar research breaker type ship in China, and they're building a heavy breaker. By 2025, arguably, China will have more ice breaking capacity than the United States government, not just the Coast Guard, the U.S. government, because we have the only capacity. The Navy is up there right now. The USS Connecticut is up there here with another sub doing the ice edge. So, you know, outside of the Navy's ice edge is an exercise when the Navy goes up there. I forget if they go every 24 months or annually, sir. But that's about the only other surface presence that the U.S. government projects there. So we are the face of the nation up there. The Russians, sir, the Russians are looking at the Northern Sea Route. You can knock 2 weeks off the transit from Shanghai that today goes through the Suez Canal to reach the European markets. If you go the Northern Sea Route with icebreaker escort, you know, the Russians are going to run a toll road there. That's their interest. So they are deriving almost a quarter of their GDP from Arctic activities, and they're doubling down. I think they moved 30 tons of cargo through the Northern Sea Route last year, and they're growing 40, 60, 70% increases on an annual basis. So I think long ball, you know, that's some areas up there where potential freedom of navigation disputes that happen today in the East and South China Seas might be happening in the Northern Sea Route. What is the capability that the United States projects there? It's probably the polar security cutters. It's probably the U.S. Coast Guard, sir, because that is the only sort of high-level capabilities that we have here in the nation.
So what do we need to focus on to help you deal with this threat?
Congressman, I would say continued the 555 that, you know, includes 515 for production on the second polar security cutter. Would love to keep the momentum and build that. You know, there's an option for a third. There's interest coming out of the White House and other parts of the government talking about medium breaker. We're starting requirements work on a medium. I guess the conversation is, how different does a medium breaker look from the polar security cutter? What might the price break be? Do we talk about more polar security cutters? Do we, you know, we have some requirements work to do, sir, but it's continued interest from the Congress, from the administration to say the Arctic, the Antarctic are both geostrategic important areas in competitive spaces that we absolutely have to take some action. The lower satellites we talked about, the domain awareness, those are all pieces that allow us to, as a nation, project our sovereign interest to the Arctic and in the south latitudes as well.
Okay, thanks. Go back.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Admiral, I want to go south where it's a little warmer. I want to go back to the issue of our southern border for a moment, and as we continue to tighten that up, and CBP is doing a great job cutting off, you know, the flow of drugs and all of that across the border, and as they do, we're going to see more and more of that showing up in our maritime corridors down there. And you mentioned that 10 to 12%, I think you said, you figure we're hitting?
I think that's ballpark, so it's 9 to 12%.
Right,
I think it's sort of where we've been the last couple of years. When you talk about what we believe the denominator is there, that's about where we are.
Right. And so, and we talked about some of the efforts with the UAS and Scan Eagle and some of the other operations down there. The problem is detection and then being able to get in front of the drugs. Is that it's a logistical problem, correct? Being able to cut them off?
Congressman, I'd say it's a time, space, distance problem. If you take a look at the source regions, so the fast boats, the self-propelled semi-submersibles, what we call low-profile vessels, very stealthy, they come out of southwest Colombia in the Pacific, maybe push down off Ecuador, and then they head way out to the Galapagos. You can take the entire continental United States if you just sort of had it to scale, and you can drop it in that eastern Pacific Ocean. It's a time, space, distance. So it's arguably, and for a former law enforcement guy, it's back to that patrolling North America for speeders with a handful of cars in a central location. It's a huge ocean, and, you know, there's a finite amount of capacity to patrol that.
Right. On the Gulf side, are you seeing more on the Pacific side or more on the Gulf side in the Mediterranean, or Mediterranean, listen to me, the Caribbean?
Congressman, we've seen historically the last few years have been about an 80-15 split. In the Eastern Pacific has been the predominant vector. Most of the cocoa cultivation is sort of shifted to Tumaco, Turbo areas of Colombia, so it's mostly Pacific-based, and that's where their established mechanism. With the instability in Venezuela, and, you know, we've lost a lot of situation awareness because Americans have been pushed out of Venezuela. There's very little intelligence capabilities left. I think we're seeing an uptick there. We've had quite a few cases, Venezuelan fishing boats, other things. And I would say maybe it's closer to an 80-20 split or a 75-25% split. But it's still predominantly Pacific-based, but I think there's an uptick. You know, and where you look is what you tend to know. We've been looking very in a focused manner at that Eastern Pacific area for a bunch of years now.
Okay. And lastly, I want to mention, you know, God forbid we have another shutdown. We certainly don't ever want to go through that again, government shutdown. But, you know, in the beginning of 2019, when we suffered that, you know, I was highly disappointed and horrified that, you know, your men and women had to forego their pay for such a period of time. And I never did really hear, how long, once it was over, did it take for them to get their back pay? Do you have any idea how?
Congressman, I would tell you, the majority got their back pay uniform within that first week, pretty quick.
Okay.
What we did was we tracked the one-offs to make sure everybody got their back pay. There's a few cases of our civilian employees, you know, 8,500 civilian employees, some NAF employees.
Yeah.
Some of them were a little more complicated, but I think in a couple weeks. So we had some Herculean efforts by our folks that work in the Coast Guard Human Resources part of the organization to work almost 24 hours a day to make sure those coasties got their pay as soon as possible. I think what the sort of the hangover effect a little bit was when you're 35 days into a shutdown and most of your parts are purchased and stocked by civilians, it took us 3, 4, 5 months to really get back to be a ready Coast Guard. And, you know, the good news was, the bad news is we had a shutdown.
That was
good
my
news
next
was it
question.
happened.
What
in the
did that?
season. Yeah.
What impact did that have on your readiness?
Yes, sir.
I know it had to be huge.
You know, our uptick in much of the country is sort of a seasonal, in search and rescue, a lot of that's seasonal when you look at, you know, the geography of the nation, not all places. Had that happened in the thick of the summer months, and obviously the budget's not cued to that, but the fact that it happened in January, we were able to get saddled up before the real busy time for some of our coastal operations, sir. But it was a 3 to 5 month sort of hangover lag factor before we were a ready Coast Guard again.
Yeah. But, and I know your men and women continue to do their job day in and day out. Can you talk a little bit about what impact did it have on morale? Because I know you care a lot about that.
Congressman, I don't think I've ever been prouder to say, you know, we sort of played to the hearts and minds of the men and women that serve and their families to say, you know, everybody in uniform, you know, raised their right arm and took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, and we're going to wake up and go to do that every day. It got harder to say, were we asking, compromising people from a safety standpoint? There's distractions, you know, men and women on the Arabian Gulf on a island-class patrol boat in Bahrain. We're patrolling next to a Navy PC-179, not much bigger ship, a few more crew doing the same mission in a very sporty area. And my men and women were worried about, you know, their spouse putting food on the table and diapers on their little ones. That's a distraction. The then CENTCOM commander, General Votel, the 5th Fleet commander, Jim Malloy, was still there, was sort of pinging into the Pentagon and saying, this is not good. I have two kind of war fighters. Those that heads are fully in the game, and some Coast Guard people that are distracted by things they shouldn't be distracted about. This is wrong. And so, sir, I appreciate the committee support. It's very tricky from a you know, mechanic standpoint to do this and fix this the way CBO scores things, but I know there's a lot of co-sponsors on this that support that. You know, fortunately this year, I guess fortunately we weren't alone. You know, there wasn't a budget on time, but when we're out there alone as an armed service, I think that's when we're most vulnerable. I think the pay our military previous years would suck the Coast Guard in. We found ourselves in a very difficult spot here, you know, in December of 2018.
Well, we got to find a way to make sure your men and women don't wind up there again.
So our men and women would very much appreciate that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Do you have any more questions? Okay. From this subcommittee for the tremendous work that the Coasties do every single day on behalf of our country. So thank you for being here, and I can assure you that we will do everything possible in a bipartisan way to provide you with the resources you need to do your incredible work. Thank you.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you. On behalf of the men and women of the Coast Guard, thank you and your fellow members of the committee on the terrific support you give us, and we're very encouraged by the trajectory we're on with your support, ma'am, so thank you very much.
We stand adjourned.